My mother's perfectly manicured hand gripped my shoulder just hard enough to make her point without leaving a mark. Julia, I need you to sit in the back row during the ceremony. Your wheelchair will be too visible in the family section, and we can't have it blocking the aisle or appearing in all the photos. You understand, don't you? 240 wedding guests were filing into St. Catherine's Cathedral while Mom delivered this instruction with the kind of forced smile that indicated the decision wasn't negotiable, despite being phrased as a request. My sister Vanessa's wedding was exactly 30 minutes from starting, and I'd just been told that my presence as a family member mattered less than aesthetic considerations for photography. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Father Michael, the priest officiating the ceremony, had been my patient when I worked as a physical therapist before the accident, and we'd maintained a friendship built on conversations about faith, suffering, and the gap between what churches preach about inclusion and what they actually practice. And he'd asked me 3 days ago if I was comfortable with him acknowledging something during the ceremony that would make my family very uncomfortable. I'd told him yes. Drop a comment if you've ever been hidden by people who claim to love you. This story is about the moment when visibility became unavoidable. My name is Julia Harper, I'm 31 years old, and I've spent the past 4 years navigating life as a wheelchair user, while watching my family treat my disability as an embarrassment to be managed, rather than a reality to be accommodated. What they saw as a tragic limitation that diminished my worth, I'd learned, was simply a different way of moving through the world that revealed who people actually were when inclusion required effort, rather than just words. The Harper family had always been about appearances, social status, and maintaining the image of success that my parents had built over 40 years in Dallas's affluent Preston Hollow neighborhood. My father Richard was a corporate attorney at a prestigious firm. My mother Catherine was heavily involved in charity, boards and social organizations that required substantial wealth and appropriate connections for membership. My younger sister Vanessa, 28, had followed the approved path: Southern Methodist University, appropriate sorority, engagement to Trevor Morrison from a family whose wealth and social standing matched our own. And then there was me, the older daughter whose life had followed the expected trajectory until a drunk driver had hit my car 4 years ago, leaving me with a spinal cord injury that meant I'd never walk again. The accident had happened when I was 27, newly engaged to my longtime boyfriend Daniel, working as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation hospital, and generally living the kind of life my parents could discuss comfortably at country club gatherings. The spinal cord injury had changed everything. Not just my mobility, but my engagement. Daniel had broken up with me 6 months after the accident, explaining that he'd signed up for a different future and couldn't handle being a caregiver for the rest of his life. My career had ended because the physical demands of being a therapist weren't compatible with my new limitations. My social life had contracted as friends gradually stopped inviting me to events in venues that weren't accessible or activities I couldn't participate in. But the most painful change had been watching my family transform from people who claimed unconditional love into people who viewed my disability as a problem that complicated their social image and required constant management. Julia's situation is very difficult, became Mom's standard explanation when friends asked about me, her tone suggesting my wheelchair use was a temporary phase I'd eventually overcome through sufficient determination rather than a permanent anti-reality requiring acceptance and accommodation. My parents had been supportive immediately after the accident, visiting me daily during my 2-month hospital stay, attending family meetings with my rehabilitation team, expressing appropriate concern about my recovery and adjustment. But as months stretched into years and it became clear that I wasn't going to get better in the way they'd hoped, their support had gradually transformed into embarrassment disguised as concern. Hit that like button if you've watched people's love become conditional when you stop meeting their expectations. You need to hear what Father Michael said. The shift had been gradual but unmistakable. Family photos that used to hang prominently in my parents' home were replaced with pictures from before the accident, erasing visual evidence of my wheelchair from their carefully curated family narrative. Invitations to family gatherings came with detailed questions about accessibility needs that made it clear my attendance created logistical complications they'd prefer to avoid. Holiday celebrations were scheduled at restaurants or venues that technically had accessible entrances but weren't actually designed for wheelchair users, making my participation awkward and exhausting. "We thought the club would be fine because it has a ramp," Mom would say when I struggled to navigate the country club's poorly designed accessible route that required going through the kitchen. "Julia, you're just being difficult if you can't adapt to minor inconveniences." Minor inconveniences. That's what my mother called the daily navigation of a world designed without considering people who use wheelchairs for mobility. My sister Vanessa had been more directly hostile about how my disability affected her life and social standing. She'd asked me not to attend her engagement party because wheelchairs make people uncomfortable, and I don't want guests feeling awkward. She'd scheduled her bridal shower at a venue with stairs and no elevator, then acted offended when I explained I couldn't attend. She'd chosen all her bridesmaids based partly on their ability to look uniform in photographs, explicitly excluding me from consideration because we can't have uneven numbers and your wheelchair would ruin the symmetry. The exclusions had been systematic and deliberate, each one accompanied by explanations that framed my disability as the problem rather than her unwillingness to accommodate family members who didn't fit her aesthetic vision. But the cruelest moment had come 3 months before the wedding, during a family dinner, where wedding planning dominated every conversation. Vanessa had been discussing the ceremony setup at St. Catherine's Cathedral, the processional order, the positioning of family members, the sight lines for photographers capturing every moment. "Julia, I need to talk to you about the ceremony," Vanessa had said, her voice carrying the tone she used when delivering non-negotiable decisions disguised as considerate requests. "Trevor and I have decided that it would be best if you sat in the back during the service. Your wheelchair is going to be very visible if you're in the family section, and we want the focus to be on us, not on accessibility issues." The words had landed like physical blows. My own sister wanted me hidden at her wedding because my existence as a wheelchair user would distract from her perfect day. "Vanessa, I'm your sister. I should sit with my family during the ceremony. And you will be sitting with family, just in the back where your wheelchair won't block anyone's view or dominate the photographs. Julia, this is my wedding day. Can't you just accommodate this one request without making everything about your disability?" Making everything about my disability. As if requesting to sit with my family during my sister's wedding was unreasonable advocacy rather than basic inclusion. Mom had supported Vanessa's position completely. "Julia, honey, Vanessa has been planning this wedding for a year. The photographs are going to be displayed in their home forever and shown to their future children. We need to make sure the images capture the day appropriately without elements that draw attention away from the bride and groom." Elements. She'd called me an element, an object in the photographic composition rather than a family member participating in my sister's celebration. Dad had remained silent during the creaking conversation, his silence functioning as agreement with Mom and Vanessa's position. My younger brother Marcus, 25, had looked uncomfortable but hadn't spoken up to defend me, or suggest that hiding a family member was wrong. I'd left that family dinner knowing that my sister wanted me present at her wedding only if I remained invisible, that my parents supported this arrangement, and that none of them understood, or cared, how their positioning revealed exactly had they thought about my worth as a family member. Comment hidden: if you've ever been asked to minimize yourself to make others comfortable, this is where that request backfired spectacularly. But 3 weeks before the wedding, something had happened that would change everything about the ceremony and the family dynamics that had positioned me in the back row. I'd been at physical therapy, not as a therapist anymore, but as a patient working to maintain the upper body strength and mobility that wheelchair use requires. Father Michael had been there too, working with a therapist on shoulder rehabilitation after rotator cuff surgery that had been complicated by his age and the arthritis he'd been managing for years. We'd recognized each other immediately. I'd been his physical therapist 5 years ago when he'd had knee replacement surgery, and we developed a rapport that had extended beyond the standard patient-therapist relationship. He'd been interested in my perspective on disability embodiment, and the ways churches claim to welcome everyone while maintaining architecturally and social barriers that excluded people who didn't fit able-bodied norms. "Julia, I was so sorry to hear about your accident," Father Michael had said when we'd connected in the waiting room. "I've thought about you often and wondered how you were managing the transition." We'd talked for 20 minutes about my life since the accident, the relationship that had ended, the career that had become impossible, the family dynamics that had transformed my disability into a source of embarrassment they needed to manage. I'd mentioned Vanessa's wedding and my assigned position in the back row where my wheelchair wouldn't appear in family photographs, or distract from the ceremony's aesthetic perfection. Father Michael had been quiet for a long moment before asking the question that would change everything. "Julia, I'm officiating Vanessa's wedding. I had no idea she was your sister. Would you be comfortable with me addressing this situation during the ceremony?" what would you say? I'd tell the truth. About who paid for the wedding. About who made the celebration possible. About the gap between what families claim to value and how they actually treat family members whose existence complicates their social image. The suggestion had been so unexpected I'd initially assumed he was joking. But his expression had been serious, and I'd realized he was offering to use his position officiating the ceremony to expose truths my family had carefully concealed from the 240 guests they'd invited to witness Vanessa's perfect day. Father Michael, I don't understand. What truth about who paid for the wedding? Julia, your father came to me 6 months ago in confidence, seeking counsel about a financial situation he was facing. He'd lost a significant amount of money through bad investments, and was going to have to tell Vanessa he couldn't afford the wedding she'd been planning. The cathedral fee alone is $15,000, and Vanessa's total wedding budget was over $200,000 for venue, catering, photography, flowers, everything she'd been planning for a year. I'd had no idea Dad was facing financial problems. He'd always presented himself as financially secure, and the family had maintained the same expensive lifestyle, despite the economic downturns that had affected many of their social circle. Your father was devastated. Vanessa had sent invitations, booked vendors, made commitments that canceling would destroy her socially. He asked for my advice about how to tell her he couldn't provide the wedding he'd promised. What did you tell him? I asked if he'd considered asking you for help. I remembered from our therapy sessions that you'd received a settlement from the drunk driver's insurance company, and that you'd been careful about investing it to provide long-term security since you couldn't work anymore. The settlement had been $2.30 million, compensation for permanent disability, lost earning capacity, ongoing medical needs, and the lifetime of challenges created by another person's decision to drive drunk. I'd invested it carefully, living on a modest budget, while the principal generated returns that would support me indefinitely. Your father said he couldn't ask you for money because you'd been through too much already and because the family had been distant since your accident. But I suggested he talk to you honestly about the situation, explain that this was an opportunity for you to participate in Vanessa's wedding in a meaningful way, even if you couldn't participate visibly. I'd felt something shift in my understanding of family dynamics and power structures. Father Michael, are you telling me Dad asked me for money to fund Vanessa's wedding? He came to your apartment 3 months ago and explained the situation. You agreed to loan him $180,000 to cover most of the wedding expenses, with a repayment schedule that would allow him to maintain his dignity while providing Vanessa the celebration she'd been planning. The conversation had come back to me in pieces. Dad visited my apartment on a Tuesday evening, something he never did. His uncomfortable preamble about family bonds and the importance of supporting each other through difficult times. His careful explanation that he'd had some temporary financial setbacks and needed family support to maintain commitments he'd made. I'd written him a check for $180,000 the next day, understanding it was funding Vanessa's wedding but believing I was participating in her celebration in a meaningful way despite being excluded from visible family participation. Dad had been grateful, emotional, promising to repay me within 2 years once his investments recovered. But he'd never told Vanessa where the money came from. She believed Dad was funding her $200,000 wedding from his own resources, confirming her belief that she deserved this level of celebration, and that family wealth should be directed toward her perfect day. Father Michael, they don't know. Vanessa has no idea I funded her wedding. They seated me in the back row of a celebration I made possible financially, while excluding me from family photos and visible participation. Would you be comfortable with me mentioning this during the ceremony? Not as revenge or humiliation, but as truth-telling about what actual family support looks like versus performative family dynamics that prioritize appearances over genuine inclusion? I'd sat in that physical therapy waiting room processing the implications of what he was suggesting. Father Michael could expose in front of 240 guests that the sister who'd hidden me in the back row was only having her dream wedding because I'd provided the funding she believed came from our father's success. I'll do it only with your permission, Father Michael had continued. But Julia, families need to be held accountable when they treat disabled members as embarrassments to be hidden, while simultaneously benefiting from their generosity. What your family has done to you is wrong, and their behavior during this wedding, asking you to hide so you won't ruin photographs of a celebration you funded, deserves to be exposed. I'd thought about it for 3 days before calling Father Michael back with my decision. Yes. Tell the truth. Let them experience what visibility feels like when it's uncomfortable and unavoidable. Type funded if you're ready for the moment of reckoning. This is where hidden truths become unavoidable public knowledge. Now, standing in St. Catherine's Cathedral 30 minutes before the ceremony while Mom instructed me to sit in the back row, I knew that Father Michael was preparing to deliver a homily that would transform Vanessa's perfect day into something much more complicated and truthful. I'd rolled my wheelchair to the back row as instructed, passing family members who carefully avoided eye contact, passing friends who'd gradually stopped including me in their lives, passing 240 guests who'd been invited to witness a celebration I'd made possible, while being positioned as insignificant to the family narrative. The ceremony had begun exactly on schedule. Vanessa looked stunning in her $8,000 dress, part of the $180,000 I'd provided. The cathedral was decorated beautifully with flowers that had cost $22,000. The photographer captured every moment with equipment and expertise that cost $18,000 for the day. All of it funded by the family members sitting alone in the back row where her wheelchair wouldn't ruin the photographs. The processional proceeded smoothly. Bridesmaids in their matching dresses, groomsmen in their coordinated suits, flower girls scattering petals along an aisle. I'd been asked not to block. Vanessa entered on Dad's arm, radiant with happiness and confidence that this celebration reflected her worth and her family's love and support. Mom cried appropriately in the front row. Marcus looked handsome in his groomsman role. Trevor's family occupied prominent seats that indicated their equal status with the Harpers. Everyone was positioned exactly as Vanessa had planned, with aesthetics and social standing carefully calibrated to create the perfect wedding she'd been planning for a year. Father Michael waited at the altar, his expression serene and pastoral, giving no indication that he was about to detonate the careful staging that had positioned me in the back row. The ceremony proceeded through standard wedding liturgy, welcome, opening, prayer, readings that Vanessa and Trevor had selected for their themes of love, commitment, and family bonds. Father Michael delivered these elements with the practiced ease of someone who'd officiated hundreds of weddings, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics. But then, just before beginning the homily, Father Michael paused. The silence stretched long enough to become noticeable, long enough for guests to stop checking their phones and pay attention to the unexpected break in ceremonial flow. Before we continue, Father Michael said, his voice carrying clearly to all 240 guests, I need to acknowledge someone who made this celebration possible, but who has been positioned in the back row where she won't appear in family photograph. PSS or distract from the ceremony's aesthetic perfection. Every head in the cathedral began turning, looking toward the back, trying to identify who the priest was referencing. I sat in my wheelchair in the last row, suddenly visible to everyone after spending the entire processional being carefully ignored. Julia Harper, Vanessa's older sister, is sitting in the back of this cathedral because she was told her wheelchair would be too visible in family photos, and would draw attention away from the bride and groom. The silence was absolute. 240 guests processing information that exposed the family's treatment of me while simultaneously trying to understand why the priest was addressing this during the wedding ceremony. Mom's face had gone white. Dad sat frozen, apparently realizing what was about to be revealed. Vanessa looked confused, not yet understanding what Father Michael was about to say. Julia suffered a spinal cord injury 4 years ago that left her unable to walk. Since that accident, her family has gradually positioned her as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a family member to be included. Today's seating arrangement is simply the most visible example of a pattern that has been developing for years. Father Michael's voice remained calm and pastoral, delivering devastating information with the kind of serene authority that arguing with him feel inappropriate even as he was exposing family secrets in front of a cathedral full of witnesses. But what Vanessa and many of you don't know is that this wedding, this beautiful ceremony in this historic cathedral, this reception at the country club, these flowers, this photography, this celebration that has been carefully planned for a year, was made possible financially by Julia. I could see Vanessa's expression change from confusion to dawning horror. Trevor looked completely lost. Mom had covered her mouth with her hand. 3 months ago, Richard Harper came to me seeking counsel about a financial crisis. He'd lost significant money through investment failures, and couldn't afford the $200,000 wedding he'd promised Vanessa. Canceling would have been socially devastating, and would have destroyed the carefully maintained image of Harper family financial success. Father Michael paused, letting the information settle. Before continuing, I suggested Richard speak honestly with Julia about the situation. He did. And Julia, who receives disability payments and lives on a modest budget from the settlement she received after a drunk driver destroyed her ability to walk, wrote her father a check for $180,000 to fund most of this wedding. She did this believing she was participating meaningfully in her sister's celebration, even though she'd been excluded from visible family participation. The cathedral was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat. Every single person was staring either at Father Michael or turning to look at me in the back row, processing information that completely reframed the celebration they'd come to witness. Julia funded this celebration while being told to sit in the back where her wheelchair wouldn't ruin photographs. She made Vanessa's dream wedding possible, while being excluded from family photos and treated as an embarrassment that required careful management. Vanessa had started crying, not the happy wedding tears she'd anticipated, but tears that Lou cat-like humiliation and dawning awareness of how she'd treated her older sister. I'm sharing this information not to ruin Vanessa's wedding day, but to speak truth about what actual family support looks like versus performative family dynamics that prioritize appearances over genuine inclusion. Julia demonstrated profound generosity by funding a celebration from which she was excluded. Her family demonstrated profound cruelty by accepting that generosity while treating her as too shameful to sit with them. Drop truth if you believe some moments require uncomfortable honesty. This exposure changed everything. Father Michael had continued with his homily, connecting the themes of genuine love versus performative devotion to traditional wedding liturgy about commitment, sacrifice, and the kind of bonds that persist when comfort and convenience are removed. But the remainder of the ceremony was a blur for everyone present, overshadowed by the revelation that the bride's older sister had funded the celebration while being hidden in the back row. The reception that followed was the most uncomfortable social event I'd ever attended. Guests approached me in waves, some apologizing for not questioning why I'd been seated separately from family, others expressing outrage about how I'd been treated. Many, simply wanting to understand how I could be generous enough to fund my sister's wedding after being systematically excluded and devalued. Vanessa had approached me during the cocktail hour, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears, her voice shaking with emotions I couldn't quite identify: embarrassment, guilt, anger, confusion. Julia, I had no idea you paid for the wedding. Dad told me he was covering everything from his own accounts. If you'd known, would you have treated me differently? Would I have been allowed to sit with my family? Would my wheelchair have been acceptable in photographs if you understood I was funding them? She'd had no answer that wouldn't reveal her character more completely than her silence already did. Mom had tried a different approach, attempting to reframe the narrative in ways that positioned the family as victims of Father Michael's inappropriate disclosure, rather than perpetrators of systematic exclusion. Julia, what Father Michael did was completely inappropriate. He had no right to share private family financial information during a wedding ceremony. Vanessa's day has been ruined by his decision to make a political point about disability inclusion. Mom, Father Michael told the truth. The only thing he revealed was how you've been treating me for 4 years, and how that treatment culminated in asking me to hide at a wedding I funded. If that truth ruined Vanessa's day, maybe the problem is what you've been doing, rather than who decided to expose it. Dad had been the most direct, pulling me aside during the reception dinner to have the conversation he should have had 3 months ago, when he'd accepted my check. Julia, I should have told Vanessa where the money came from. I should have insisted she seat you with family. His voice had broken. I should have been a better father to you after the accident. I let your mother's discomfort with disability guide how we treated you, and I justified exclusions by pretending they were about logistics rather than our own failures to adapt. The apology was genuine but couldn't undo 4 years of systematic marginalization or the public humiliation of being hidden at an event I'd made possible. The most unexpected response came from Trevor's family, particularly his mother Eleanor Morrison, who'd approached me during dessert service with an expression mixing outrage and determination. Julia, I need you to know that Trevor's family had no idea you'd been seated separately, or that you'd funded this wedding. If we'd known either fact, we would have insisted on appropriate accommodation and acknowledgement. What your family has done is unconscionable, and Eleanor Morrison doesn't remain silent about unconscionable behavior. She'd been true to her word. Within an hour, Eleanor had reorganized family photographs to include me prominently, had moved place cards to seat me at the head table despite Vanessa's careful planning. That had excluded me from that position, and had delivered a toast that explicitly thanked me for making this beautiful celebration possible, through generosity that makes the rest of us look small and selfish by comparison. Comment reorgan. Nized if you believe the best allies are the ones who take action rather than just expressing sympathy. Eleanor Morrison changed the entire dynamic. The aftermath of Father Michael's revelation transformed not just the wedding day, but the family relationships that had been damaged by 4 years of systematic exclusion and marginalization. Vanessa spent the first week of her marriage dealing with social fallout from having her wedding become known as the ceremony, where the priest exposed the bride for hiding her disabled sister. Who'd funded the celebration? Friends had questions. Social media had opinions. The carefully curated wedding photographs she'd prioritized over my inclusion were permanently associated with the revelation that I'd been positioned in the back row of an event I'd made possible. But the most significant change was internal, rather than social. Vanessa had called me 2 weeks after the wedding, her voice carrying none of the confident entitlement that had characterized her earlier communications. "Julia, I've spent 2 weeks thinking about what Father Michael said and about how I've treated you since your accident. You're right that if I'd known you funded the wedding, I probably would have treated you differently. But I shouldn't have needed financial motivation to treat my sister with basic respect and inclusion. I'm ashamed of who I've become, and I want to understand how to be better." The conversation that followed had been the most honest discussion Vanessa and I had ever had about disability, inclusion, and the ways families maintain prejudices, while claiming to love unconditionally. She'd asked difficult questions about why she'd found my wheelchair embarrassing, why she'd prioritized aesthetics over accommodation, why she'd accepted our parents' narrative that my disability was a problem requiring management rather than a reality requiring adaptation. "I think I was scared," Vanessa had admitted. "Your accident made me realize that disability can happen to anyone, and excluding you was my way of pretending it couldn't happen to me. If I kept you separate and hidden, maybe I could maintain the illusion that disability only affects other people, not our family, not people like us." The psychological honesty was more than I'd expected, and it created space for rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by 4 years of systematic exclusion. Mom's response had been more complicated and defensive. She'd spent weeks trying to justify her behavior while simultaneously expressing regret about outcomes she hadn't anticipated. Her narrative positioned her as someone who'd meant well but had struggled to adapt to my disability, rather than someone who'd prioritized social image over genuine family inclusion. "Julia, I never wanted you to feel excluded. I was just trying to help Vanessa have the wedding she'd always dreamed about, and sometimes that meant making difficult decisions about logistics and aesthetics." "Mom, you didn't make decisions about logistics. You made decisions about whether I was valuable enough to include visibly in family celebrations. That's not about accommodation, that's about worth." We'd continued therapy sessions that helped her understand the difference between discomfort with disability and actual logistical challenges, but the relationship would never return to what it had been before the accident exposed how conditional her love actually was. Dad had been the most committed to genuine change and accountability. He'd repaid the $180,000 within 6 months, much faster than the 2-year timeline he'd initially proposed, by selling investments and reducing his own lifestyle expenses. More importantly, he'd started attending disability advocacy workshops, and had become involved with organizations promoting accessibility and inclusion. "I can't undo 4 years of making you feel like your disability was something to be ashamed of," he'd told me during one of our monthly lunches that had become a new tradition. "But I can educate myself about the barriers I've been maintaining and work to dismantle them for other families dealing with disability." His advocacy had been genuine and sustained, moving beyond performative allyship into actual work that challenged his social circle's assumptions about disability and accommodation. "Type accountability if you believe the best apologies include changed behavior." Dad backed up his words with sustained action. The most meaningful outcome wasn't the changed family dynamics or the financial repayment. It was what happened with Father Michael's decision to tell the truth during the ceremony and the broader conversations it sparked about disability, inclusion, and the gap between what families claim to value and how they actually treat members who don't fit expected norms. Father Michael's homily had been recorded by guests on their phones, and had gone viral on social media platforms discussing disability rights, family dynamics, and religious communities' responsibilities regarding inclusion. Within 3 weeks, the video had been viewed over 2 million times, generating discussions about how families maintain prejudices while claiming unconditional love. The publicity had made Father Michael a sought-after speaker at disability advocacy conferences, and had led to broader conversations within religious communities about the difference between claiming to welcome everyone and actually building inclusive spaces that accommodate diverse needs. The Harper Wedding Homily, as it became known in disability advocacy circles, had become a teaching tool for discussions about performative inclusion versus genuine accommodation, about how families prioritize appearances over actual support, and about the ways disabled people are expected to minimize themselves to avoid making others uncomfortable. But for me personally, the most valuable outcome was the clarity it provided about relationships, and the difference between people who love conditionally and people whose support persists when inclusion requires effort rather than just words. Eleanor Morrison had become a genuine friend and ally, using her substantial social influence to promote accessibility in venues throughout Dallas, and challenging social organizations to move beyond token inclusion toward actual accommodation. She'd introduced me to her network of wealthy women who'd become advocates for disability rights, creating a community of support I'd never expected to find. Trevor had proven himself worthy of Vanessa by supporting her journey toward understanding and change rather than allowing her to maintain comfortable prejudices. He'd educated himself about disability, had advocated for accessibility in his own workplace, and had demonstrated that growth was possible when people were willing to confront their own biases. Most surprisingly, Vanessa herself had become a genuine advocate for disability inclusion within our social circle. She'd started volunteering with an organization promoting accessible design in public spaces, had used her social media platform to discuss her own learning process about disability prejudice, and had rebuilt our relationship based on genuine understanding rather than obligatory family connection. 3 years after the wedding, I'm living independently in an accessible apartment, working as a consultant helping organizations improve their disability inclusion policies, and maintaining relationships with family members who've demonstrated through sustained action that they understand how wrong their earlier treatment was. The $180,000 I provided for Vanessa's wedding was repaid in full, but I've never regretted the decision to fund the celebration, not because it led to public exposure of family dysfunction, but because it forced conversations that needed to happen about how families treat disabled members when inclusion requires effort, rather than just words. Father Michael's decision to tell the truth during the ceremony wasn't revenge or humiliation, it was truth-telling that created accountability in a context where my family couldn't ignore or dismiss what they'd been doing to me for 4 years. The public nature of the revelation made it impossible to maintain comfortable narratives about logistics and aesthetics, when the truth was that they'd viewed my disability as an embarrassment that required management. Tell me about a time when someone exposed a truth others wanted to keep hidden, or when you realized that what you thought was love was actually conditional acceptance. How did that revelation change your understanding of relationships, and what would you say to someone whose family treats their disability as a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be accommodated?